As a child, I loved the walk to school on the days it rained. The air dense with petrichor, guppies in puddles, snails trailing on moss covered stone walls, and fresh green leaves gleaming against stormy grey skies. But most importantly, the promise of rain days. Each time a cloud burst in the evening, I hoped that it would rain heavily and continuously for a few hours through the night so that my low lying school and the roads to it flooded and school was called off, what I like to call a rain day. My school, and indeed all of Jew's scheme, was built on land reclaimed from the sea and marshes that lay in between the little sandbar of Juvim and Salsett Island. This history makes itself visible year after year as the lanes and homes are reclaimed by the monsoon sea. The monsoon bears the sea and with its onsets blurs the sharp edges we claim. Yet Drew's scheme, which floods every year, is demarcated as solid land on a map. An imaginary line has been drawn to separate land from sea, a duality in place of the complexity of marshes, mudflats, and estuaries. Maps were created by a colonial perspective that erased complexity for simpler administration. Recognizing the dynamic nature of the lines that come from colonial thinking helps us live with hydrology instead of against it. Drawing lines between land and sea is a lot like drawing lines with ink on water. The lines disappear as soon as the act of drawing them ends. The language of duality that divided land from sea also divided nature from culture, organism from environment, and built form from landscape. This language forces us to believe that floods are created by natural phenomena rather than by insensitive construction. These divisions of land and sea stand in contradiction to all our lived experiences of a leaky, watery, seasonally wet terrain, of rising and falling tides. My research for the Inhabited Sea project began with the idea of a third coast of Bombay, now invisible in maps, where the Mithi and Mahim river waters met the sea as two creeks. This watery terrain once separated the highlands of Salsett and Bombay. Maps are the most accessible and widely accepted forms of representation. They carry the power to be mistaken as reality. I found it easiest to locate us here through two acts of construction that make the city: the historic cartographic map and ubiquitous satellite imagery. This 1865 map of Bombay hides the complexity of wetness in the way it is drawn and annotated. The shallow waters around the creeks are darkly hatched to seem like dry land. However, as the key reveals, they are mud covered at high water, which indicates that they are simultaneously both land and sea. The map thus constructs the land on which the city grows. I focused on studying different practices to understand how they construct the environment. The project quite literally took me from the sea at Burli to the desert of Kutch and through many thresholds of wetness along the way. I studied three practices: one human, one machine, and one non human animal. As the city has grown, its increasing infrastructure has merged into its imagined geography and ecology. The railway lines and roads were once the first connections over creeks and marshes. The city grew around these first reaches of water. The maps of the city set the stage for mangrove forests, shallow muddy waters, and tidal regions to be filled over by planners who had never experienced the terrain and only thought they were changing functions on solid land. Sion Causeway was built in 1803 over the Mahim Creek to connect Sion to Kurla. A set of letters written to the military board in 1845 speak to the impossibility of accurate surveys. The depth of the creek could not be ascertained. Its soft-yielding mud sunk anyone trying to measure it. The causeway, once built, blocked the tides, accumulated monsoon silt, and created new land. In the Gazette of Bombay City, 1909, S.M. Edwards speaks about the difficulty of building the Sion-Kurla Railway. Strong tides carried away the tons and tons of soil and rock that were being thrown into the creek to make the foundation. Excerpts from these texts show us that the causeways created silty lands out of muddy waters. Numerous creeks and carries, marshes, and mangrove thickets were displaced in the favor of landmaking. Finally, the train tracks for which the creek could not be filled were floated over large hurdles formed of mangrove bushes. Laid over floating cotton bales, the base of the tracks was spongy, floating, and absorbent, more viscous liquid than solid. A density of sweaty hot bodies, packed to act as one, formed the Mumbai local train compartment today. Warm, live bodies move and merge into a single form, and the train becomes the skin. This hard infrastructural skin bubbles up, peels, rusts, and deteriorates as sweat, dirt, mud, rain, paint, plant juices, and other secretions work on them and bring them into wetness. Upon closer examination, the generic vocabulary for wetlands and creeks of words like landfill, edge of water, river is dispelled. The samples from the Mithi can hardly be called soil or water. Viscosity is a quality of land and form, and of the very stuff that makes the shore, the materiality of infrastructure, bodies in terrain and water. The train tracks accumulate material around them. The railway lines flood. The stormwater runoffs from the city feed farms along low-lying railway land. The stuff that makes landfill is not mud or rocks. It breaks off and moves with the tides. Concrete debris, broken toilets, plastic, a sock, a toothbrush, a comb, a toy, a weapon plant growing out of a bottle are bodies and urban wastes float into the sea. The Mithi is made of us. Infrastructure, landscape, and organisms merge into new being here. The land sea separation is also a perspective founded on colonial imaginations of individual and property. The language of duality requires the definition of an individual body othering everything that lies outside an impermeable skin as environment. Can re examining the boundaries that define the body allow us to see the coast differently? Along the Sivri and Thane creeks, the flamingos arrive to feed in the muddy, saline waters as their breeding grounds in Kutch and elsewhere dry up. Flamingos feed on larvae, small insects, blue-green algae, crustaceans, and small fish that inhabit coastal wetlands. Their feeding practice, which requires them to swallow large amounts of saline water, is supported by a unique system of internal osmoregulation. Excess salt accumulates at the salt glands in their nostrils and is shaken off by the flamingo as it crystallizes. Much like the salt pans that operate in the same environment as the flamingos. This is the coast from Thane Creek, where the flamingos arrive, to Kutch in northern Gujarat, where they breed. Straightened strips of the coast allow us to see the maps lying between land and water, but sections across the strips reveal various slopes along a gradient rather than a sharp edge. Analyzed through the slope, the sections reveal the salinity and strength of tides. The flamingos inhabit a particular slope, where fresh and saline waters meet and make mud flats. An analysis of slope and freshwater sources allows us to see the environment suitable for the flamingos. As the flamingo feeds and inhabits this terrain, it asks us to consider another coast, one drawn through the bodies of the beings that inhabit it, a line through mangroves, wetland grasses, coast-loving waders birds, each of whom have a unique way of dividing salt and sweet waters within their bodies. A transient coast that is drawn at a particular threshold of sediment. As the flamingos make their way from Mumbai to Kutch, they harness the wetness of the winds and skies. When they swim over the sea, dense, heavy winds, thick with evaporated water from the sea surface, buoy them up, roughly up to 200 meters from the sea level. Here, their wings flap to gain speed rather than just stay afloat. As the monsoonal column rises, they rise. keeping company with jet streams found at 9,000 meters above mean sea level, utilizing the pressure differential between the heavy cumulonimbus clouds and the opposing jet stream to glide effortlessly. The wing of the flamingo draws a line invisible to us across the atmosphere, separating wet winds from dry. These inhabitations of these coasts marks a separation as material and as imagined as the separation of land and sea in maps. The landscape of Kutch undergoes dynamic transformations through the seasons. Flamingos embody the unpredictable monsoonal, tidal, and cyclonic fluctuations of their breeding grounds. The patterns of movement are nomadic rather than migratory. They move to find the ideal watery conditions instead of moving at specific times. After laying their eggs on mud mounds in the run of Kutch, they stay as long as it is still inundated with water and food is plentiful. As the run dries out, they make their journey south, following the balance of sweet saline water that creates their environment. The run and its dynamic wetness breathes pastoralism into life. Kutch is home to India's largest community of nomadic herders. The Rabaris, Maldaris, and Jats traverse the run with their camels, goats, sheep, and buffaloes, and cows in search of greener pastures, a monsoon held in shrubs and grasses. Rabari cosmology views the desert as a transformative, fertile terrain that births and supports nomadic creatures, binding them in journey and fluidity. In Rabari myth, the alchemy of the run transforms the fleeing Rabari princess Meera into a flamingo, saving her from an undesirable marriage and her people from persecution. As the flamingo lands, it skims the surface of the water, using resistance to skid to a stop. At this point, a species transforms into another, and a shared language of wetness is born. When a young Rabari girl gets married, her mother gives her a bed sheet embroidered with images of symbiotic plants and animals that make the desert, and the real feathers of the flamingo retrieved by her father from the banks of a lake after a week long camel ride through the desert. The stitches on the cloth mirror the sharp lines and harsh forms around them. The material, the symbolic, and the mythical weave into a common reality shared by all desert nomads. In Kutch, I encountered the Buggies, who are expert trackers and keepers of a dying art of navigating the desert. They interpret footprints. They're able to identify species, gender, speed, movement, direction, and time of journey, all from the imprints left in the sand. The Rabaris operate in the knowledge that animals always find their way. Navigating the desert for the Buggies and the Rabaris then becomes an act of seeing dynamic signs, of following animals, of noticing wetness and vegetation rather than reading geographic landmarks. The vast expanse of the desert mirrors in the open sea. To an unacquainted eye, they are both empty, and yet there are those trained in material language who speak this guarded tongue, reveal it, and translate it. I found this special set of semiotic practitioners, trackers, and navigators in the sea too. The sea navigators of Kutch see a set of colors in the waters. An excerpt from a Kutchi poetry seen here describes a method to locate a ship with respect to the shore. I quote, "When the sun comes overhead, we take a plate of bell metal, clean it, and fill it with the waters from the sea. At noon, we watch the color of the sun in the water. If the color is black, the coast is close enough to see. If it is yellow, the ship is 10 zam away. If it is white, the ship is 20 zam away. If it is green, the ship is 30 zam away from the coast. If it is red, we firmly believe that the ship is deep in the high sea, very far away from the coast," says the boatswain. Similarly, to a Koli fisher, the sea is not a monolith. There are qualities to sea water. The Kolis identify distinct kinds of sea through the same sets of color. The water can be mirror-like and clear, Kanch, so you can almost see the seabed, or Safwa, white and foamy. These waters are always receding and indicate the presence of Erli, silverfish, Pilje sardines, or paplet. Similarly, waters can be pila, lal, neela, hirva, or kala, all signs by which to read the ever shifting sea and the kind of fish it is more likely to harbor at that given time and place. Edward Lear, traveling across India in 1875, painted these scraps off the coast of Bombay and from the shore. As with all agents of wetness, Lear too saw a plethora of colors in sea and sky, not a monolithic blue, but a dynamic palette of grays, yellows, purples, and greens. When looking out to sea from land, the sea is assumed to be in motion, shifting and swelling, ebbing and flowing, while the land is static. From a coolie boat out at sea, it is the land that turns, shifts, and grows, the horizon that splits, splices, rotates, and dances. The coolie boat is in the same relative motion as the waters. It is the ground that moves up and down as the coolies drive the stakes for dole net fishing into the seabed. The traditional coolie dole net is tied on these stakes and then uses the change in the direction of high and low tide to trap fish. At Worli, the high tide comes in from the south, changes direction and force until it ebbs out towards the north. The lines on the drawing represent the change in direction by the hour. When land is seen from the tide's perspective, there are portions affected by high tides, portions affected with the low tide, and protected coves that are not hit by the direct tides at all. When rearranged according to the hour and strength of tide that hits the edge, the coast can be remapped to show edges more likely to erode, spaces where water can intrude, and high ground safer for building. If city makers saw this as the ground of planning and design, we might consider working with wetness rather than resisting water, negotiating high ground and low ground instead of building sea walls, and being agile with our building rather than demanding waters to still. Can cities look for the threshold of salinity, slope and wetness, rather than flat and high solid ground? Living practices seek, construct, and operationalize their own ephemeral lines and wetness, separations that are as fleeting as the events that make them, visible only as long as they operating act, like trails left by flamingos as they land. Drawing from wetness urges the design of practices rather than forms, shifting the lens from permanence to transformation, urging a view of the city through time instead of geography, from sea instead of land, and from aqueous terrain instead of immutable ground.